Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today, we are looking at the classic science fiction movie 12 Monkeys. This is a movie that really doesn't get talked about that much anymore, despite there being a show on the SYFY Network of the same name that was inspired by this movie. So, was this movie simply too complicated for its own good? Let's be real, a Terry Gilliam movie isn't exactly the easiest to watch on some days. Now, before we get started, make sure to follow the blog, MetrObeliskRadio.blogspot.com, to get all of the updates related to MetrObelisk Radio. Now, with that out of the way, let's get right into 12 Monkeys. Now, let's move on to the creative team. This movie, just like I said, is directed by Terry Gilliam. Now, most of you might know him from Monty Python, but he would go on to be a movie director. Movies that he's directed include Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Time Bandits, Brazil, The Fisher King, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, and The Man Who Killed Don Quixote. Now let's move on to the writers. We have the first one at Chris Marker. Now, he wrote a lot of shorts and documentaries, none of which I'm going to try to pronounce because I don't speak French. He would write the short that inspired this movie, however, called La Gîte. Now, it came out in 1962, and it has a lot of the same concepts that this movie has, which I will get into just a little later. Now let's move on to David Peoples. Now, if you're a sci-fi fan, you've probably heard this name. He was the writer for Blade Runner. He also wrote Clint Eastwood's last Western, Unforgiven, and the movie Soldier with Kurt Russell, which many people believe to be the spiritual successor to Blade Runner. And the third writer is Janet Peoples, and this would be the only feature film that she would ever write. Now let's move on to the character analysis portion, and we'll start with Bruce Willis as James Cole. Now, he's a convict in the future that has chosen to carry out a quote-unquote voluntary mission to retrieve biological samples from the Earth's surface. He's then transported back in time to do the same thing to track the virus's path of mutation. We then have Madeline Stowe as Catherine Riley. She's the psychiatrist that treats Cole when he first comes back to 1990 and later helps him when he returns in 1996. She initially doesn't believe Cole when he says he's from the future, but later finds out everything he says is true. And then we have Brad Pitt as Jeffrey Goins. Now, Brad Pitt being a rising star back in 1995, he was a patient at the Baltimore Mental Institution in 1990 that met James Cole that would later become the antagonist when Cole returns to 1996. And then we have Christopher Plummer as Dr. Goins. That's Jeffrey's father, who is of the high stature. Now let's move on to the narrative analysis portion, and the plot for this movie is rather simple. A virus breaks out in 1997 that kills 5 billion people. The survivors go underground, and the animals rule the surface. In order to find a cure for this virus, scientists send people back in time to collect samples to trace the virus's mutation. Now, this movie is rather unique in that the characters serve the plot, which is in most science fiction, that's not surprising. But the plot actually services the concept. So what is the concept in this movie? It's a time travel movie that's concept is time travel only exists because somebody did on a time travel mission inadvertently caused whatever happened in the present to happen. In this case, somebody on a time travel mission created the virus and caused the outbreak. And this theory is supported in the movie in quite a few areas. Let's start with the opening text. The opening text describes how in 1997, 5 billion people will die from a virus and the animals will rule the world, and the Army of the 12 Monkeys caused it. This was said by a schizophrenic patient in a Baltimore mental institution in 1990. If we watch the movie, we see that it's James Cole that says these things to Dr. Riley. For the first 30 to 35 minutes, James Cole is supposed to be in 1996, but is quote-unquote accidentally sent to 1990. He was not accidentally sent to 1990. He was supposed to be there, and we know that from the opening text of this movie. Now, what else does James Cole do in 1990? Well, he meets Jeffrey Goins, a mental patient whose father is of a high order and can pull him out of the mental institution. James tells Jeffrey about a virus that will break out and cause all these people to die, and the Army of the 12 Monkeys does it. This comes back later when James Cole actually arrives in 1996, and he runs into Jeffrey Goins at a fancy dinner, and Jeffrey tells Cole that he gave him the idea and he passed it on to his father, who developed the virus. Then there's the mechanic of the voicemails. Cole is supposed to call a specific number to report his progress to the present. Because he's in 1990, though, it's the wrong number. But in 1996, he gives the number to Dr. Riley, and she leaves the phony message to a carpet cleaning company about, get how crazy this sounds. The Army of the 12 Monkeys will take over the world and blah, 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 blah. It's revealed very shortly after that it was her voice that James Cole heard on the answering machine tape before he traveled back to 1996. Now, how does this get revealed? James Cole recites her entire voicemail back to her, even though she's not within earshot of her, even though James is not even within earshot of her making that phone call. Now, about halfway through the movie, Dr. Riley was giving a talk about how people were warning about a virus wiping out mankind as early as the 14th century with, in 600 years, this is going to happen. Then she talks about unnamed soldier in World War I spouting the same thing before getting to James Cole and talking about the Cassandra complex. For those who don't know, the Cassandra complex is basically when one's valid warnings or concerns are disbelieved by others. Now, this has its roots in Greek mythology. Cassandra was the daughter of Priam, the king of Troy, and struck by her beauty, Apollo provided her with the gift of prophecy, but when Cassandra rejected Apollo's romantic advancements, he placed a curse on her that nobody would believe her warnings. So Cassandra was left with the knowledge of future events, but was cursed in the sense that no one would ever believe her. Now, getting back to the movie, we know that the unnamed soldier in World War I was Jose, someone who was friends with Cole, and the early 14th century person could be something that was explained in the beginning of the movie, and it wouldn't surprise me if most people found this to be a throwaway line, but it could be relevant in terms of this theory. Cole is talking with Jose in the cell next to him after Cole has been quote-unquote volunteered to go on a mission. They talk about how they hide the volunteers up on the 7th floor because they've all lost their minds doing these voluntary missions. So there were people who traveled back in time before Cole even did, and at one point in this movie when they're in Philadelphia, there was an old homeless man who tells Cole that the people in the present track you through your teeth. The homeless man was missing the majority of them. And this was confirmed at the end when Jose traveled back to carry out a mission to kill Dr. Riley when he asks Cole why he ripped out his own teeth. Now, this movie has an ending that most people won't like, but it does go along with the movie's logic. It's revealed that the Army of the 12 Monkeys didn't do anything to release the virus. It was actually the scientists who worked on it. Cole and Riley get to the airport. Cole attempts to shoot the scientist, but Cole gets shot and killed instead. Throughout the movie, Cole has a dream where he sees a little kid witness a death and a blonde woman running and screaming towards the victim. Riley then turns to look at the kid and realizes that that's Cole as a kid. Now, getting back to the ending, if Cole prevented the virus from spreading, then there would be no reason for him to travel back in time at all. The time travel in the present simply would not exist. Cole had to go back in time because he gave the idea for the virus that wiped out 5 billion people. This line is repeated throughout the movie. The past already happened. You can't change it. If this movie had a happy Hollywood ending with Cole preventing the outbreak of the virus and getting the girl at the end, that would have broken this movie's logic up to that point. So how was this movie received? Again, sites like Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic didn't exist back in 1995, so we are looking at this reception through a modern audience's eyes. And just a fun fact, IMDb launched in 1990, so that one might be a little more credible for the time. This movie has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 90%, that's based on 68 critic reviews, and an audience score of 88% based on 391,013 audience reviews. This movie has a Metacritic score of 74 based on 20 critic reviews, and a user score of 8.8 out of 10 based on 459 ratings. And this movie sits on IMDb at an 8 out of 10 based on 564,640 reviews. Now, this movie had an estimated budget of $29 million back in 1995. If we adjust that for inflation in 2020 numbers, we get a budget of $48,788,884.51. And the movie grossed $168,839,459 back then. Now, if we adjust that for inflation 2020 numbers, we get a worldwide gross of $284,051,340.23. It's pretty safe to say that this movie was a sleeper hit. It was a little movie that came out in 1995, and it just blew up out of nowhere. Now, this movie is definitely not beginner friendly. If you are not into science fiction at all, then I would personally not recommend it. And I'm not talking about if you're into Star Wars or Star Trek. I'm talking science fiction movies like Brazil or 1984, 2001: A Space Odyssey, or The Butterfly Effect. These types of movies that sell themselves on their concepts and not their stories and characters. This movie definitely falls on more of the surrealist side of the spectrum, not only in terms of the science fiction genre, but filmmaking as a whole, and I equate that to that's just Terry Gilliam being Terry Gilliam. If you need any further proof that he's a surrealist, watch Brazil or watch one of his most famous movies, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas with Johnny Depp. And, try to convince me that he's not a surrealist. And I'll end the episode off with this. Selling your movie on a concept or theory over a cohesive plot and characters is a really risky proposition. You could make an engaging movie just based on if the concept or theory that is presented in the movie is strong enough to carry it all the way through. Now, on the successful side, you have movies like 12 Monkeys and 1984, and depending on who you ask, The Butterfly Effect. But on the opposite end, you have movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey that just goes on and on and on for too long with absolutely nothing going on for long periods of time. And by the time you hit the end of 2001, you just wonder why it couldn't just be 30 minutes shorter. And it's a real shame that this movie doesn't get talked about, since the concepts in this movie have bled over into movies such as the Terminator franchise. But more on that later.